So I'd like to welcome you all to the international book launch for The Power and the Money, Tevi's new book, featuring a special conversation with our special guests, who will be officially introduced in just a couple of minutes. My name is Elana Maizel, and I am the executive director of the Israel Law and Liberty Forum. And because many of you are actually new faces for us, I'm going to explain what we do and what the Cherut Center does, and then turn it over to the main event. So the Forum is an Israeli legal educational initiative that's committed to fostering a richer discourse on law and democracy within Israel's legal profession. We also advance young leadership that we hope will contribute to a more secure and flourishing Jewish state. So to give an example of why this is particularly important for those of you who live in Israel, for those of you who follow Israeli news from abroad, I'm sure that you in some way experienced the incredible social tension around legal reform last year. We were founded several years prior in recognition that Israel is still forming its law and governance in nearly every possible area, and that the study of great conservative and classical liberal ideas in Hebrew would serve an existential need for the country and provide new tools for Israelis to build a healthier future together. So that's an educational project that we started pursuing 4 years ago, and which we're going full bore on today, whether through student chapters at top universities or our highly regarded online law journal, podcasts, fellowships, or events such as these. We're committed to ensuring a diversity of viewpoints within Israel's legal discourse, and to empowering attorneys to engage with, negotiate, and fix some of the deep lacunae within Israel's world of legal ideas, whether in constitutional, criminal, international law, or other areas. So right before turning to this event, I'll also mention, because it happens to be in English, that we're having yet another event tomorrow with an international guest, barrister Natasha Hausdorff. So for people who have been following kind of the Hasbara war on international law, she'll be here with us today, and if you're interested in attending, you're welcome to just let us know. The Forum is one of several educational projects at the Cherut Center, which is a broader ideas institution that's working to cultivate conservative leadership across Israeli public life. And having worked at Cherut for over 10 years, and having co-founded the Forum, I'm perfectly happy to talk to you a lot more about them when the time is right. So please be in touch. But the time is short, the guests are great, and you did come here to celebrate with us the release of what might be Tevi's like 60-second book, if I have my math right. So in the first half of tonight, Gil will interview Tevi about the book, and in the second, Tevi will be asking Gil about how aspects of the book might compare and contrast with Israeli history, where the economic function and ethos of the country emanate from very different, quite socialist roots. We will then open the event to questions. I will be eternally grateful to you if the questions end with a question mark rather than a period. And you are, of course, welcome to take food and drink throughout the evening. We'll make sure that it's flowing, and to use the hot water dispenser in the kitchen area outside. Now, to our speakers. Tevi Troy is, first of all, Tevi Troy is a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a senior scholar at Yeshiva University's Straus Center, a former senior White House aide, and a former deputy secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He's the author of 5 books on the American presidency, including The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and titans of industry. He wants people to know that he has 2 brothers, Dan and Gil. Round of applause for all brothers. Dan is also here tonight, but has taken a non-stage seat. The books, by the way, are for sale and will be inscribed by the author. And Rena Troy, I believe, is handling the sale. Here you go. Professor Gil Troy is a senior fellow in Zionist Thought at the Jewish People Policy Institute and a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University. He's a leading presidential historian and Zionist thinker. Troy has authored 8 books on the American presidency and 5 on Zionism, including the best-selling Why I Am a Zionist, a Jerusalem Post columnist. His upcoming book is To Resist the Academic Intifada, Letters to My Students on Defending the Zionist Dream. Sounds good. So we'll be obviously unveiling that at some point. Tevi and Gil, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's such a thrill to be here to see, I can't say old friends anymore, but friends of old standing. People who've really come from near and far. I want to give a particular shout out to the Americans who defied the Iranians and flew here. I'm Yisrael Chai. We really love, we're thrilled to have you. And I also want to say those who defied the traffic from Tel Aviv to come here. I'm Yisrael Chai, and we're still functioning, and even more so. When I agreed to this, I knew I was going to be losing credibility, because when I say it's an amazing book, no one believes me, because I'm biased. But fortunately, since we agreed to this event, The Economist has called it timely. The New York Times Deal Book covered it and had an excellent interview with Tevi. It's been praised not just from coast to coast, but from Atlantic, from one side of the Atlantic to the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you, Jerusalem Post. And it hasn't even been formally launched. The formal launch is Tuesday. So when I tell you it's a good book, you don't have to believe me, but when they tell you it's a good book, you know that it really is. And, but before we get to the book, I want to ask the question that is on everybody's mind, which is, Dan, our older brother, served both in the Justice Department and the Food and Drug Administration. You served in the White House. What was in the milk in 8507, 215th Street? How did so many of these Troy brothers get so obsessed with American politics, both in writing about it and in actually, like the two of you, shaping it and making history happen?
Well, it seems like a question that you would know the answer to, but I'm happy to take a crack. First of all, thanks to all of you for coming. It's really wonderful and terrific to see every one of you. And thanks to Ilana and the Resisting Center for putting this together. I think our parents' house had a lot of intellectual curiosity and a willingness to allow us to pursue that curiosity. I see so often that parents say, oh, I don't want my kids to look at this, I don't want my kids to look at that. And of course, that's the thing the kids are going to look at. There's actually only one book that my parents would not allow us to read. One book. It was called Ball 4 by Jim Bouton. It was a book about the kind of what's going on in behind the scenes in baseball with them hitting on girls and doing drugs and cursing. There's a lot of cursing in there. Of course, that was the book we all made sure to read. So I think pursuing our intellectual interests was part of it. I think my parents were also deeply, deeply patriotic. They loved America. I say loved because, unfortunately, they've both passed away and we miss them. But they just had this sense of what a great country it is. They came from European roots, and they knew that if those ancestors had not moved to America, they would not have survived. We wouldn't be here. And I remember once, Gil tells a story about going to the voting booth with my parents. My parents used to take us to the voting booth. There was this thing where you would actually go to the voting booth. You didn't just send a mail-in ballot 6 months in advance. And we took it seriously. And one time my mom, there was this big lever that you pull to close the booth and then to open it. And my mom did it wrong and her vote didn't get registered. And she was distraught. And she went to the election officials and she said, I didn't actually get my vote in, but I accidentally pulled the lever. And she had to sign an affidavit to show that she didn't, the first vote wasn't a vote, and then they let her vote a provisional ballot the second time. But it really impressed upon us how important the right to vote is, how important our leaders are in America, and how much she cared. And then you couple that with my dad's love of history. He was a history teacher. And I'm younger than Dan and Gil, and Gil's love of history and Dan's love of history and government and law and politics. And Gil really inspired me in getting a PhD. I knew that a graduate degree was something I was going to pursue, but I didn't know in what. And when Gil told me that for his oral exams to get his PhD, he had to read 500 books in a year, I know some people run screaming, But I ran right in. I said, that sounds like an amazing year, and it was. So thank you for the inspiration. Thank my late parents. Thank Dan for the inspiration. But I think those are the factors: intellectual curiosity, love of America, and allowing us to pursue it.
And it was a setup because we had Jewish stomachs. We never drank milk. You've written about presidents and intellectuals. You've written about presidents and popular culture. You've written about presidents and disasters. And by the way, I read this strange word, COVID. What was it, 2 or 3 years? And the need for a battle plan to be developed in the United States of America about a potential virus in Tevi's book long before everybody had COVID on their mind and on their lips. So how did you get to The Power and the Money? By the way, great title. How did you decide that now it was time to talk about presidents and CEOs, which is what the book is about?
Well, Gil, you're right. I do have this approach to my books. I call it Presidents and Blank. And what blank is A, something that nobody has pursued before. So nobody had done the thing on intellectuals before. Nobody had done presidents and disasters before. But it's also something that is of the current moment, something that speaks to where we are in America at this time. And so my last book, which Ilana also hosted a party for, thank you very much, on Fight House, was about infighting in the White House. In 2020, everybody was talking about the Trump White House infighting. We've never seen anything like it before. So I decided to explore whether it had happened before. And right now, here we are in the mid-2020s, and there's something strange going on with the American people's relationship to corporations. You know, corporations employ 30 million people. They get about $40 trillion in revenue annually. Everything that we own these days basically comes from a corporation. The iPhones that we have, the books, the media we consume, it comes from corporations. So it's not like they don't do anything good for us, but there's a lot of hate towards the corporations. What I've noticed is that it's long been a Democratic talking point to denounce corporations, but in recent years, it's become a Republican talking point as well. And so this interesting shift where both parties seem to hate corporations was something that I thought was worthy of exploration, and I wanted to see if the relationship between presidents and CEOs and the history of that relationship told us something about it. And so I started digging in, and I got to say, Gil, you were a little skeptical at first. You said it can't just be stories of presidents talking to CEOs. It's got to be about something more. So you inspired me to look about whether there were broader themes. And I went back as far as John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and saw these people were integrally involved in the U.S. economy, in building massive industries that didn't exist beforehand. But they also had their run-ins with politicians, and they also engaged in certain behaviors that we certainly would not approve of. But they started this relationship that has existed for 150 years. It's evolved, to be sure, over time. But it is something that has its origins in history, and history can teach us something about it.
And what's the flow line? What's the overall theme? What's the key that we're learning by looking at all these relationships?
I think we learned two things. First of all is that government has become more and more involved in what corporations do and can do. Since the time of Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, we've seen the development of a regulatory state, of regulatory bodies that did not exist before. When John D. Rockefeller is building his monopoly in the 1870s, he's noticed by politicians. U.S. Grant denounces the trusts, and he was referring to Rockefeller among others, but there was no mechanism for doing anything about it. And so then the Sherman Antitrust Act passes in 1890, and suddenly government has a tool. And what I found in this book is the development of many government tools over time has led to the situation where corporations really need to be aware of government in everything they do. So that's number one, that the intertwining of government and business is something that has been developing over 150 years. And the second thing is that if you are a newly minted CEO, on your first day, you need to meet with your government relations person and get a sense of what's going on and come up with a battle plan. Because what Washington does is going to be more important to whether you are a success as CEO than almost anything else. And I think those are the two key themes.
So in 1912, when Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were battling, they both talked about big business. They had no idea how big business was going to be. And it's just a whole different scale.
Oh yeah, and I make this point that in 1870, you could live your entire life without having really any interaction with big business or corporations. They didn't exist as we know them today. Or big government. The only interaction with the federal government you would have had was when the post office delivers the mail. And now, big business and big government are involved in everything we do. As I said earlier, the phones we carry, the media we consume, the books we read, the cars we drive, the fuel that powers the cars. And at the same time, government is also involved. It subsidizes and regulates our education and our roads and our food. And so both of these entities that had very little to do with the average individual American in 1870 are now fully intertwined in everything that Americans do today. And I actually have an appendix in the book where I try to graphically depict that growth of the regulatory state so that it is, I could say what John D. Rockefeller was dealing with was blank space. It doesn't mean it was a good thing, because he was allowed to do some bad things without any mechanism for stopping him. But now that blank space is so small that corporations need to take into account. And I'm not saying they can't make money, because they make huge profits, but they need to think about what government wants, because they're often, in complying with regulations, trying to, or effectively carrying out certain governmental ends, because that is what the government's trying to do. So they're not, again, they're not limiting their ability or eliminating their ability to make profits, but they are trying to shape how the companies act.
We know that the Republican Party is the party of big business. We know that the world looks very different. We've heard in Israel again and again, the world looks very different from the Prime Minister's office. Right? That was one of the things that Ariel Sharon said for the disengagement, which we'll talk about in group therapy later. But we also know that the world looks very different from the Oval Office. Dwight Eisenhower said to John Kennedy, a Republican to a Democrat, all the easy decisions get made outside this room. You only get the headaches. So looking at this arc, are you more struck by the ideological difference between Republicans and Democrats, or are you struck more by the convergence that at the end of the day, it's business, it's politics, it's power, it's money, it's America just sort of going forward or stumbling ahead, whatever, however optimistic or pessimistic you're feeling at that moment?
Well, it's interesting, the phrase you use, that the Republicans are the party of big business. And it may be true, but it's less true today than it was. And it's diminishing over time. And I find historical antecedents in the power and the money that address this issue. So for example, in 1880, James A. Garfield is running for president, and he asks his political advisor, a guy named Amos Townsend, about this guy named Rockefeller. He doesn't even know how to pronounce the guy's name or spell it. And he says, this Rockefeller guy seems to have money. Should we reach out to him? And Townsend warns him that the name Rockefeller cuts like a knife in Pennsylvania, and he should avoid it, because Pennsylvania then, as now, is an important electoral state. And so he warned, and he also warns him to keep this off paper, meaning have no paper record of even thinking about interacting with Rockefeller. So there was wariness of big business even back then by Republican politicians, because Garfield was a Republican. And then you have, in the 1900s, you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. He hated Rockefeller, he hated Standard Oil, and he certainly wasn't a fan of the corporations, and he was also a Republican. So you do have a lot of instances where the Republicans are not necessarily on the side of big business. At the same time, you are right that there is more of a sense of it. So Eisenhower had this group of CEOs he played golf with. He called them the gang. And they were people he was comfortable with, and they came from the same milieu. Whereas today, if you have a CEO of a major corporation, and let's say they went to an elite Ivy League school, they're probably more comfortable with Democratic politicians. That doesn't mean they always agree ideologically, but as Republicans increasingly denounce corporations, and as Republicans increasingly engage in policy ideas that are problematic for corporations, then maybe the CEOs are going to say, you know, both parties are a headache for me, but I might as well hang out with the people whose kids go to the same school as my kids. And I think that presents a danger for Republicans. I think that mantle of being the party of big business may not be something they hold on to forever.
The book is very rich and filled with anecdotes based on tremendous research. And you've been working on this for about 2 years, two and a half, for 40 years? 4 years. Time blurs. And we know that it's really hard to time a book Our good friend Yossi Klein Halevi wrote this amazing book about Islam and Judaism and the connections, and landed in New York to push the book on September 10th, 2001. I wrote a book about presidential couples right before the second inauguration of Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton. Nobody wanted to talk about it, and a year later the Monica Lewinsky scandal blew up, and they didn't put the book into paperback. So you can never time these things.
How about our friend Dan Senor, who wrote a book called The Genius of Israel that came out the week after October 7th?
So life, it's hard to predict. So given what's going on at this moment in American politics, which of course is very different than what happened last week and 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, do you feel that your book is more timely, as the Economist said, or less so? And in what way has these last couple of weeks made this book more resonant? Because I want to push the book tonight.
Well, as I said earlier, Gil's been a mentor to me in so much of what I do in this history business. And he said to me a long time ago, you can't time a book. The book comes out when it comes out, and the world events are what the world events are. But you can get lucky. And I think I got lucky in this. I mean, as I said, I had the idea 4 years ago. I've been working away at it. The whole world with publishing and agents, it's a challenge. And to get any book out is a struggle. And this book, thanks to all the challenges and thanks to all the hurdles, is coming out now. And happens to be right during a presidential election where you have a guy like J.D. Vance, who's the vice presidential candidate on the Republican side, who's a huge critic of corporations. And Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are as well. And Trump, I guess is of the world of business, but has also been critical of business, not as much as Vance, I would say. But this is an issue that is top of mind. I mean, I'm not sure the New York Times would have interviewed me on this at another time. They were thinking about this issue. So,
and Vice President Harris just unleashed her economic plan
her economic
this week.
Plan. So, you get lucky. But you also have to do the work to make the book filled with the readable anecdotes that you refer to.
So I want to read something, and this way you can say, oh, I went to a reading today, which is much fancier than just a conversation between two brothers. CEOs should also recognize that their fame lets them expand the universe of tactics. This is in the conclusion, which has some very practical pieces of advice for CEOs. Some are so well known that they can compete with the president in trying to shape the narrative on an issue. So the first part on page 256 tells about the fame that CEOs have, and we do live in this era of the celebrity CEO. But the next warning is that although these lessons can help, CEOs must constantly be aware of the degree to which corporate unpopularity creates significant vulnerabilities for companies and even entire industries. So we're talking about an age of the celebrity CEO and the unpopular corporation. How does that play out within the business world and between business and politics, which is your focus?
Yeah, well, one of my lessons in The Power of the Money is you have to engage with Washington, but you also have to be super careful. Jamie Dimon, I cite as someone who's very good at this. He decided...
Tell us who he is.
Jamie Dimon is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And he decided a long time ago that instead of what his predecessors did and what he started doing of going to Washington twice a year, he was going to go to Washington twice a month. And he's very effective at engaging with people on both sides of the aisle. Now, you take someone like Elon Musk, who is really embodies that thing you were talking about from the reading about the celebrity CEO. He has a lot of power, he has a lot of fame, but he also angers a lot of people. And right now he's all in for Trump, and I'm not sure that's the best strategy, regardless of who wins the upcoming election. Because Michael Jordan has had this bit of wisdom about how Republicans buy sneakers too, which is why he didn't want to get too political when he's trying to sell his Nike shoes. Well, Democrats buy cars too. And Democratic politicians could be in government when you want someone to buy Starlink or SpaceX or get a contract. So if you're too far out there, it can create challenges for you. Another thing I talk about in the book is this idea of selective enforcement. The regulatory state is so vast that not every regulation is enforced. It just can't be. But if you run afoul of the government, if somebody doesn't like you within the government, then they can enforce every regulation against you in particular. And Musk has encountered this in the Biden administration, has had investigations into his company from multiple government departments. And the Wall Street Journal had a very interesting editorial on this where they listed all the investigations. And they say, we doubt any memo emerged from the Biden administration saying, go after Musk and his companies. But they also said the message couldn't be any clearer that he is persona non grata to the upper echelon of the Biden administration. And so some career bureaucrat who is in charge of making regulatory and enforcement decisions can say, you know what, if I go after this Musk guy, those political guys won't be too mad at me. And that is a challenge. So again, you have to engage if you're going to be an effective CEO in the modern world. But if you are too far out there for one side or the other, it can come back to bite you.
There are some poseurs who fancy themselves presidential historians, but have never really been inside the White House except to visit their brother. During the process of writing this book, how did your experience in the White House as Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, and I think one of the highest ranking officials to be Shomer Shabbat and Shomer Kashrut at that time, how did your day-to-day experience, how did the fact, I have to just boast about on you for 1 minute, that Karl Rove during the George H.W. Bush re-election campaign was George W. Bush. The George W. Bush election campaign was told that there would be a problem having Tevi be a key advisor because he only works 6 days of the week. And he said, I'd rather have Tevi Troy 6 days a week than anybody else 7 days of the week. Yes, Team Troy. So, but you've been there. You've been in the spot where it happened, and I've just sat in the archives. What in this book emerges because of your understanding of the way things really work as opposed to those of us who just sit in archives?
Well, it's a great question, and I certainly wouldn't denigrate the people who sit in archives, because sitting in archives for my first book on intellectual presidency before I'd worked in government helped inspire me to go work in government, because I sat there and I had memos in my hand that had pencil marks from Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon. I said, wow, this is really cool. So I get the sense of the policy process in a way that somebody who didn't work in the White House may not have, and how something bubbles up, how these decisions are made, and which things are kind of, which things are fake and which things are real. I also had experiences that actually inspired me because I saw President Bush meeting with CEOs. And I do remember this one instance where President Bush was pushing an agenda on healthy eating and healthy living. He wanted people not to eat as much high-caloric food and exercise more. So we had a bunch of CEOs from the fast food industry and from the beverage industry, the snack industry, and they all sat around a table. And you mentioned Karl Rove. I'll tell a Karl Rove story also. Karl Rove walks in. The president's a little late, and he sees all these CEOs around sitting there, and they're just kind of, they're competitors, so they don't really have anything to say to each other. And the president's not there, and they're a little nervous, and they don't have anything to drink. So Karl calls one of his minions and says, get these guys drinks, go to the White House mess. And so the minion runs down to the White House mess and gets a whole bunch of drinks. But the White House mess has an exclusive contract with Coca-Cola, not PepsiCo. And Indra Nooyi, who was the CEO of PepsiCo at the time, is not going to be photographed at the White House drinking a Coke product. And Karl, who's a very savvy guy, realizes what's going on. And he says, find this woman a Pepsi product. And in somebody's desk drawer, there was an old, dusty, room temperature Diet Mountain Dew. And he brings it to Indra Nooyi, the CEO of PepsiCo. And I noticed she put it down in front of her, and it was there for the photo, but she never drank a drop of it.
Well, once we're telling war stories about meetings before the president, you did have a stint as the White House Jewish liaison. And I understand that it made you the most popular person at the White House Christmas party because all the switchboard operators wanted to know who was that guy who got so many phone calls and so many persistent phone calls. Tell us a story about before the Jewish leaders met with the president.
Well, I had a couple of stories along those lines. It was a very stressful job. I was Deputy Secretary of HHS, and that was less stressful.
Running how many hundreds of thousands
right,
of...
70,000 people, $700 billion budget, less stressful than being the Jewish liaison in the White House. And in one...
so Rob gets it. A leader of AIPAC.
And in one instance, we did have this meeting with the president and a bunch of religious leaders, heads of schools. And I had to brief the president that one of the women was the head of a religious seminary, and she does not shake hands with men. She was an Orthodox woman. So the president says, got it. And he comes into the room and he's very gracious. He bows to her. He doesn't shake his hand. I mean, not bowing straight, but he kind of nods at her. And he has her sit down next to him. And he has this meeting. And this is back in the days after 9/11, so we're all nervous about terrorism. And he's talking about the strategy against Al Qaeda. And he gets all worked up about all the things we're doing, how we're putting them on their back foot. And he says, and we've got our foot on the bastards' throats and we're not letting go. And then he looks at the pious woman next to him and he says, I'm so sorry, ma'am, for using a bad word. And she said, say it again. So that was a lot of fun. But I would like, at this point, to transition a little bit to Gil, because Gil was one of the thoughtful readers of this book. He gave me invaluable advice on the construction of the book and on sources. And again, always someone I look to when writing history or anything. And Gil, I was just curious about your thoughts on how this relates to the Israel situation. Do you have these kind of big name CEOs who are palling around with prime ministers and leaders of the Israeli government?
So let me take this in two different directions. First of all, we have to remember Israel is really, really, really small. I remember years ago, a speaker came to Montreal and was talking about big ideas. And I said, in all your years as an operative, have you ever seen an idea that started, and we saw this because in the Reagan administration, think tank would generate an idea, and you could literally trace how an op-ed and a policy paper then became a statement by the president and then became a policy. And I said, has that ever happened in Israel? And he looked at me lovingly and he said, you forget, Israel is Chicago. It's all about ward politics. It's all about personal relationships. And in order to really understand Israel, you have to stop. And when America, one of the things that's overwhelming about writing about America is that it's so big. With Israel, it's so small and so intimate. And so many of the leadership, so many both from the CEO level to the Knesset members to the prime ministers themselves, have fought with one another, literally in battle, know one another because they went to school together. And so to really understand what's going on in the Branja, in the exclusive elite club of Israel, you have to sort of go really into all the personal relationships. That's one piece of it. The other thing is that whereas the United States is very, very much rooted in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, they may not be the most popular names these days, but they're quite popular in my circle, even as I criticize some of the things Thomas Jefferson did, some of the abhorrent things he did. Israel, of course, in its genes, in its DNA, is socialist. But one of the things I've learned over the years, and my father was a good right-wing Beitari, and we were among the few people in 1977 who, when Menachem Begin was elected, didn't go Begin rhymes with Fagin, and didn't go, who is he? We went, yes, finally, a leader has emerged. And I, at a certain point, had to go up to my father a few years ago after living here many years and say, Dad, I have to kind of apologize because with each passing year, I'm more and more a fan of David Ben-Gurion. Because David Ben-Gurion made some really important decisions in the Altalena. My father actually wanted to go on the Altalena, but his mother wouldn't let him. And he was ready to defy Ben-Gurion. He was ready to defy everybody else, but he had to be a good Jewish boy and listen to his mother. He was 18. He didn't go, but we grew up knowing stories of friends of his who were injured on the Altalena, and we know about the horrible betrayal. On the other hand, we also understand, and certainly when we look at what goes on the Palestinian side, the need to have one army and have leadership. And as I've gone deeper and deeper into trying to understand David Ben-Gurion, one of the things I understand, or at least my little theory, is that part of the reason why Israeli socialism was so successful is because they were the worst socialists ever. The two fundamental mistakes they made as socialists, and many came from David Ben-Gurion, was one, they respected private property, and two, they respected civil liberties. And a lot of it came from Ben-Gurion himself. Ben-Gurion was exiled from here by the Turks during World War I and ended up in this small little Jewish community called New York. And in New York, he learned about the power of private property and the power of civil liberties. And then in 1923, he went to the Soviet Union. And his comrades expected him to come back, all excited, all inspired. But even then, he saw what the Soviet Union was. And so the socialism that emerged on Kibbutzim, the socialism that emerged in 1948, once the state was established, the socialism that he led us into, had obviously elements of that collective spirit. There was a great fight once between Golda Meir and Shulamit Aloni, and Shulamit Aloni started saying, "I believe," and Golda Meir said, "In the Labor Party, we don't use the word I, we use the word we." And it's interesting to see how the Labor Party has changed. But part of the reason why this country succeeded with the socialist roots, and then obviously there was a major change after 1977 and a major change after Netanyahu, was because it was a broken kind of socialism, which was actually a genius kind of socialism.
So since you mentioned socialism, and since you've done such deep dives and such great books on our Zionist history and Zionist leaders, what would the Zionist leaders of years past, most of whom, not all of whom, were socialists, make of I mentioned Dan Senor's more recent book, but let's talk about his older book, Startup Nation. What would they make of the Startup Nation? Would they be mortified because of their socialism, or would they be thrilled because of the fulfillment of Zionist dreams?
Yes. On the one hand, they really would be so thrilled at the degree to which Israel was able to adapt, to grow, to change. And one of my favorite Zionist texts is Beryl Katznelson in 1934 writes about revolution and tradition. And he talks about how every human being, not just every Jew, not just every Zionist, every human being needs the capacity to remember and the capacity to forget. You need to remember your roots so you have identity, but you need to forget enough so that you could innovate. And Beryl Katznelson was as labor Zionist as they came, as socialist as they came. And what is Startup Nation? And what is the real genius in this country today? And they talk about it, by the way, in their book, both on Startup Nation and the Genius of Israel, is that we do deeply have that ability to speak, not just in decades, not just in centuries, but in millennia and eternity. And I think that's actually been one of the things that's been sustaining us since October 7th. But we also are constantly innovating. And so they would see that there's a connection. I was asking about the flow-through. There's a linkage you can make from the socialists of yesterday to the startup nation of today. And by the way, you see it in the left-right dynamics in this country, which are very different than the left-right dynamics in the United States of America. Today's leftists in Israel, those evil people who are protesting, are family people, are patriots, right? And we're so, and serve in the military honorably. Right? And on October 7th, we saw that Achim L'Neshek had an important network that kept people in touch with one another and mobilized people. And so the left-right breakdown isn't the same as you see increasingly in the United States of America. And we see the connection and we see the solidarity. And it's very important for us not to fall into the same language that we use in the United States to describe what's happening in Israel. So I think they would see that. But I think they also would be appalled by some of the excessive materialism. I think they'd be appalled by the huge gap between the rich and the poor. They'd be appalled by the fact that, we were just talking about this, how the education system is extraordinary for too small a group of people and isn't serving enough of the people. And so they would see the blessings and the curses. But on the whole, whenever people ask me, what would Herzl say? What would Ben-Gurion say? What would Ben-Gurion say? What would Begin say? They'd say, wow.
You talk about this difference between the U.S. and Israel, and I want to get back to America for a second, because in my book, I'm talking about the CEOs who are interacting with presidents, and all of these people had a college education, most of them, or not all of them. I mean, the recent ones all have a college education. Some of the older ones, like Henry Ford, didn't. But
and they boasted about not having the college education.
But today, if you get a college education, the things you learn are maybe a little different than what we learned in our day. And you certainly don't learn to love America, Western civilization, Israel. And I was just wondering what you think that means for the future CEOs of America. I mean, these are the training grounds. What's going to happen in the future? And I ask this question in particular because if you count up the books of the Troy boys in total, I think we're now at 20 books. Gil has 14, I have 5, Dan has 1. So 20 total books by Troy boys. And Gil has 2 new ones out. One is over there on the table. It's the guidebook to October 7th. And the second, which is free and available there, unlike my book, which unfortunately I have to pay for. But you also have another book about letters to your students who are on college campuses. And I was wondering if you could talk about your forthcoming book. It's so classic. This is my 5th book. It's taken 4 years. And It comes out right now in August, and Gil has a book coming out right before me and right after me. So he's incredibly prolific and incredibly impressive. But talk about this next book, about the letters to your students, and what it means for the future of America's leaders.
The book is called To Resist the Academic Intifada, Letters to My Students on Defending the Zionist Dream. And the book started 2 years ago when I came back from my first post-COVID speaking tour, and I was struck by how despairing students were, and parents, my peers, were. And I was also struck by how many of them felt like there was something wrong with where Donald Trump had taken the country, but there was also something wrong where, whatever you want to call it, woke, critical race theory, this excessive radicalism was also taking the country, and they couldn't quite articulate it. And the same way that I felt this burning desire when I wrote my book, Why I'm a Zionist, over 21 years ago, to explain both to the next generation, to my beloved students, and to my peers, their parents, what's going on, I started writing it. And I started writing about us, there's a certain age in this room, which I call Generation Hope. We are what I call the Eastern European boat people. Most of our parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, came over on the boat, as if there was one the boat that could fit all 2 million from 1880 to 1920. And we knew growing up in Queens, in lower middle class Queens, that our lives would be better than our parents' lives and our grandparents' lives. And we knew that all we had to do was roll up our sleeves and not just wait for it to happen, but make the miracle happen. And I know so many of the room, each of us, both in Israel and the United States, have lived that miracle. And we also saw this crazy primitive country called Israel emerge and flourish. And how can you not hope? How can you not be proud? How can there be so much despair? And originally I wrote this beautiful book about the four freedoms and Franklin Roosevelt, how inspiring it could be, but I felt it was too in the air, and I wanted to be more down to earth. And so I started writing about my life, not that I've done anything so interesting, but that it's emblematic of this life that we've all experienced. And I started writing it not as a memoir, but as letters to my students. Because my editor, Adam Bellow, said, you're a professor, talk, teach, and tell some of the stories. And then after October 7th, I had to rewrite it, and after the spring encampments, I had to rewrite it again. And to get to the core of the question, the crisis on the campus today isn't just a Jewish crisis, and it isn't just a Zionist crisis. But the campus that I went to, the campus that so many of us enjoyed, and look at me, I'm a case of arrested development. I got to academia and I never left. That campus doesn't exist in too many corners, especially in the most expensive and the most elite corners of the world, where the Jews worship most. Those holy, holy places have been given billions of dollars. And to be in a campus which doesn't appreciate critical thought, and doesn't appreciate true liberalism, lowercase L liberalism, and doesn't appreciate a world where I loved the fact that I wasn't sure where some of my professors stood, left wing or right wing, because that wasn't the point. The point was not to hijack the classroom, that holy podium, and turn it into a political platform. The point was to use it as a launching pad to think, to grow. And I don't want to exaggerate. I'm very careful in the book not to say it's happening everywhere, but it's happening in too many places, too frequently, by too many of the most powerful, influential professors and students, because they use social media to bully those who simply just want to be lovely nerds like I wanted to be. And so there's a crisis. It's not just a Jewish crisis. It's not just a Zionist crisis. It's a crisis of higher education. And it's a crisis of liberalism. And so the book is trying to speak both to students and to parents and to say, we've got to take responsibility, and you're not crazy. And by telling some of the stories that I've heard from students, look, I defended Israel on campus for 20 years at McGill University. I never felt threatened. I occasionally got unpleasant emails. I was okay with it. We know where you live. The only good Zionist is a dead Zionist. Ripping down mezuzot. These are stories from Columbia. These are stories from Harvard. These are stories from Yale. These are stories that happened in the last couple of months to our students, paying $86,400 a year. That is a tragedy. And I read the Chronicle of Higher Education every week. And the degree to which they cover this simply as a free speech issue. And I am an ardent advocate for free speech. But there are clear red lines. And when you start harassing people, when you start threatening people, when you start intimidating people, when you start defacing university property, and then you get amnesty, that's an educational problem. That offends me as an educator, not just as a Jew and a Zionist and American. And so the book is trying to spin a tale, our tale, that says we've got to stand up and change. And the smaller book, which is theirs, is a more sort of how-to guide. So this book is a why-to guide, about why to fight, why to stand strong, and this gives some of the basic arguments that we need simply to defend the right of Israel to exist and to flourish. Not that I feel passionately about this.
Well, no dearth of Troy books, and that should lead to no dearth of questions. So we're happy to take some questions from the audience. Great.
Are not the masters of the public, but the public are the masters of politicians. But it doesn't work that way. Why?
Well, there was that French politician who said, the people have spoken, I must follow them because I am their leader. So yeah, I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, you have people who lead and take parties in different directions, as we've seen recently in the US, but at the same time, you've got to be receptive to the concerns of the people and to the frustrations of the people. And well, you know, and it's not working out so well all the time in domestic politics here. So it's clearly a challenge that all the Western democracies are facing right now.
I'll put the two.
Thank you very much, both of you, and thank you for referring to your father, who I knew very well. A blessed memory, of course. The educational problem, how it will affect corporate America, how it will affect any youth of today and tomorrow. Where is the problem? Is it money, outside money? Is it anti-Semitism? Is it the fact that the Jew is down and therefore you can step on him? What has been involved over the last year in this regard, and how it will affect both the corporate and government interrelationship and the future of Zionism? Thank you.
So I'm going to say something unpopular. I know it's really fun to talk about the Qatari money and how the Qatari money has distorted higher education. I've actually never seen any proof. I've seen the numbers, but the argument usually is, you know, look, they gave 500 million here, and you know, all these numbers add up, and they were hidden, and they shouldn't have been hidden, and it's very important to be transparent. But I've never seen the degree to which they affect what's going on campus. As an academic, I don't say follow the money. I say follow the learned societies, and follow the tenure track. And what we've seen, and by the way, there's a huge difference, and it breaks my heart, because I was one of those people who used to always look at young students and say, go with humanities. This is the opportunity to really, you know, cultivate your soul. Then you can catch up and go into STEM, to science, technology, medical issues. But increasingly, we're starting to see in the university campuses, again, in many of the elite universities, that in the humanities departments, in my world, the world that I worship, in the American Historical Association, in the American Sociological Association, in the MLA, the Modern Languages Association, they've changed their charter. And the charter says, instead of saying, these are learned societies in order to advance critical liberal thought, they say this is to advance social equity and social justice. I'm in favor of social justice. But I don't want classrooms used for that way. I don't want universities simply being political factories. And when they use certain phrases, they're going beyond left, right, and they're going to a certain kind of ideology. Once that happens, I wouldn't get tenure today. I wouldn't get book prizes today. I wouldn't get promoted today. And we see, and I saw this even in my day, that the academics love to perpetuate their own. I would go to, when I was on the job market, I would go to places where they were already top-heavy in experts in social history and economic history, and they'd gone beyond political, you know, narrative political history. I say, oh, they should really hire me, and I know they won't, because they perpetuate themselves. This is methodological. And then I went to other places where they were heavy on military history and political history. I said, they love me because I'm one of them, and they're going to hire me, and they shouldn't. And now we're seeing it being done in politics, politically. And it's scary when you take one kind of mission and you distort it with a second kind of mission. And then you add to that. And that's the issue that's been building for decades. And I used to say that the great corruption in American higher education was you get paid, you pay all this money, parents pay all this money for the best teachers, but in fact, we're hired as the best researchers. Now, the corruption in higher education is that people think they're still paying for the best form of education, but they're actually all too often, and again, we have to be careful not to exaggerate, getting a form of political indoctrination. And this year, we saw the degree to which that indoctrination curdles and turns against a particular group, Zionists, settler colonialists. But notice, when they're burning the Israeli flag, what else are they burning? The American flag. And notice, when we're waving the Israeli flag, we're also waving the American flag. And we're going to see this, I'm sorry to say, on the streets of Chicago. And we have to keep on connecting the dots between what's happening in the fight for America and American values, left, right, and a true form of liberalism. This goes way beyond Trump-Harris. And the fight for Israel and Zionism. And to go back to the first question, and by the way, thank you for your wonderful words in the Jerusalem Post, Greer. Thank you. And for your leadership over the years. I think one of the things that we talk about the people, quote unquote, and we talk about the politicians, we also talk about social media, right? And the degree to which social media, especially in college, gives both a small group of radical professors and the small group of radical students added power. And you have lots of students who just want to get by. And it gives them an added punch because I spoke to one of the activists at Columbia University, the pro-Zionist activist. I said, what about like the regular student? He says, they just came, they just want to learn. Or they just want to do sports, they don't want to get involved. And if they get involved one way or the other, they risk social death, they risk social shaming. And so we see how a small marginal minority punches way above its weight, both on the professorial level and on the academic level. So now we have that third dimension with the people and the politicians.
Don't you think it was an inevitable outcome of what you're just describing when 50 years ago we allowed people like Angela Davis and the Weathermen and other people who squashed critical thinking and taught their kind of thinking to their students? And we saw this coming, and a lot of us got involved on college campuses and tried to stop it on the college campuses and protested and, you know, and came up and argued about it, but we couldn't stop it. So this is an inevitable outcome that started at least 50 years ago or sooner. So,
I'm supposed to push my book, but the failure of my book, even though it hasn't come out yet, is because it's such a response to October 7th, the spring encampment, and it's this letters to the students. It's more so ideological. I don't have the time in that book, and maybe it's for another book, to go deep into what happened, to really tell the history. We need a history about what happened. And absolutely, the 60s is part of the story. But let's be honest. There's also right now a smothering, a suffocating approach to intellectual conversation on the right and on the left. We're seeing an age of all or nothingness. I always like to quote one of Tevi's friends and mentors, Ed Koch, who said, if you agree with me on 7 of 12 things, please vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 things, please see a psychiatrist. And my friends on the left and on the right have bought into this all or nothingness, which frankly terrifies me as a thinker who loves to be in the mushy but muscular moderate middle.
Tevi, is your book inspirational in any way?
That's a great question.
It definitely inspired me. I mean,
and me.
Look, I think, and this gets a little bit to your question, I don't think any of this is inevitable. I think people make choices, and every generation has the chance to prove itself and to show what it can do. And I think some of these CEO leaders, especially the founder ones that I profile, are incredibly inspirational. They built entire industries out of whole cloth. That doesn't mean that I agree with every tactic that John D. Rockefeller did, but the development of all these industries that I talk about in the book, including mass media with Henry Luce, and the energy industry with Rockefeller, and the auto industry with Henry Ford, again, who did a lot of bad things also and was a terrible anti-Semite, although he did a little tshuva towards the end, which I found interesting when I researched the book. And the development of the modern high-tech companies. America gives people these opportunities to develop new innovative products that can help reshape the world. And talking about the contrast that Gil was laying out with Israel, Israel is small, America is big. If you can make some big product that can catch on in America, it can catch on in the whole world, and it can change the world. So yeah, I'm very inspired by the capacity of the private sector to do amazing things. But I also have real concerns about if we don't let it do the innovative things that it's done in the past.
Tevi, question. I know the book is about a struggle, the struggle or the interaction between the titans of industry and the head of the federal government. I wanted to ask you why we don't see more titans of industry in the federal government. A good model for all of us East Coast people would be Michael Bloomberg, who brought a lot of assets from his private experience. And the West Coast, we had the movie stars. One became president, one became governor. That's the local industry there. So could you say something of why such a dearth of fantastic talent from industry is not finding its way to Washington?
It's a great question. It's because Washington is a city that destroys careers, it destroys people. And you think about the people who've tried to get jobs in government, and they found that through the Senate confirmation process, all the stuff that was unearthed, that it wasn't always great, but it wouldn't have been unearthed if they hadn't dipped their toe in the water. So that's one of the things that I found. Another thing is that you have these leaders, and I talk about Jack Welch in the book. He knew 10 presidents, and many of them asked him to join their cabinets. And he always said no. And his reason was, I'm the CEO. I get to be the boss. I can do what I think is right for the company. And he was known, as many of you know, as Neutron Jack, because if he saw a division wasn't performing, he would fire that division or sell it off. Or he came from a GE culture that would fire the 5% least performing people in the company every year. You can't do any of those things in the federal government. And Jack Welch recognized that his skill set would not translate to the federal government. So I think the problems that you encounter in just getting the job is one thing, but then once you have the job, it's just not, in many ways, as satisfying. And I say this as somebody who worked at senior levels in government, and I found that I was effective at certain things, but I also saw that there are a lot of people who were just as smart as I was, or smarter, who government just didn't work for them because they didn't know how to pull the levers. They didn't like it. And those people may have more of a business inclination.
And by the way, one of the scary things about Startup Nation is that it draws so many of the best and brightest who otherwise might go into Israeli politics, and instead they go to, and they do amazing things, but who's going to lead us? Who's going to save our souls?
I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for an organization like an APEC to develop a strategy and be more aggressive, targeting the CEOs and to influence the CEOs from a Zionist perspective. Now we know from a talent perspective, you can just, Israel is a microcosm, of all the great businesses because they want the talent that's in Israel. But could there be an opportunity for Israel to, just like we saw, for instance, in some of the law firms, how they said, we're not going to hire you if you were in these demonstration lines. Our clients, they don't want to work with you if you're so, with the horrible behavior that was on display. But Israel's not known for being proactive, from a PR perspective. But it seems to me that this is a very important segment to be proactive and aggressive and have a strategy around.
I love this idea, and I do think that maybe Israel's not proactive, but AIPAC is proactive, yeah. And AIPAC has been very eager to go out there and find slices of the population that can be influential and work on them. Jesse Helms was an anti-Israel Republican conservative senator for many years until AIPAC worked on him and brought him to Israel, and he turned around. And my brother Gil hosts these dinners, these AIPAC dinners at his house of black leaders, evangelical leaders, Hispanic leaders. And he tries to show them a side of Israel that maybe they don't see. And I think it's a great idea to have AIPAC work on CEOs. And given this book I just wrote, it may give me an entree to talk to AIPAC about this, and I'm going to do that when I get back to America. So thank you.
He's less successful at it. His charming kids are the one who really win everybody over.
First of all, I want to thank both Tevi and Gil for the wonderful and interesting books that you've put out. And Gil, Tevi, I've got to admit that whenever I read your blogs, I come away not only having learned a lot, but especially each time I learn 3 or 4 new words that you put in there, because I thought I had a good vocabulary, but nothing like yours. So my question is, now that you've mentioned, and it's true that both Republicans and Democrats are anti-corporation, what do you think is going to happen with this antitrust issue against Google and breaking up Google, both if a Democrat becomes president or if a Republican becomes president?
Yeah, well, first I have to say a quick thing about Marshall, whom I met about 5 years ago. I met him at a Shabbat dinner in Kent Mill, and I had just put out my book, Fight House, about infighting in the White House. And I told Marshall about this book, and he said, you know, that's very interesting, but I just read this piece in Tablet magazine about infighting among Israeli leaders. And I said, I wrote that piece because there was a link to my book. I was trying to come up with a Jewish angle for my book. So thank you for all your careful reading of my stuff, and I appreciate it. In terms of your question, look, I think that long term we've got to see how these CEOs can work together with government and how they can. The book gives a lot of lessons about how to carry out these strategies, and I think that you can learn from the book about how to be more effective at this, and I think that's kind of the pathway that I would go down.
Thank you. In the past, most CEOs and people from business were interested in producing products and things that made people's lives easier, and that's how they made their money. However, in our age, there's a tremendous change in this whole equation, because now people like Elon Musk have now moved to the front of being what might say the defenders of free speech. So this is a political issue, but it's also a philosophic issue. And this strikes at the very basis of countries like Israel and certainly America and England. And if you look at what's happening in England today with the attempt, one might say, to push down free speech as we in America understand it, you see that these, let's say, very wealthy people now have power over how people can express themselves. So if you put something on Facebook that the politicians or somebody doesn't like, in England, you can be prosecuted and put in jail for such a thing, and they're doing that every day. In America, because of the First Amendment, it's very difficult to do, and a lot of shows on YouTube show the difference between America and England in this way. But this is a new problem that, let's say, the captains of industry, because they now have their hands on the levers of the basics of democracy, which they did not have before. Before it was just really a money question. But now it's a very serious question. So how does that add into what you're saying?
Well, it's a great question, Roy, and thank you for being here. But one of the things I find in the power and the money is it's not necessarily a new thing, because these CEOs that I talk about in the book have frequently sought platforms to get their views out. So when Henry Ford buys the Dearborn Independent, he was looking for a platform. And it's a recurring theme in the book that you have these leaders who try to get their message out in various ways. Now, with the tech CEOs, they have new capacity to do it, and there's new technologies for doing it. And you mentioned England and America. They're obviously very different systems. Obviously, England doesn't have the same kind of First Amendment protections that we do. But what the CEOs now can do is not just get their message out, and Elon Musk has something like 195 million followers on what was once Twitter, now X, but they can, to some degree, control what messages get out on the platform. Now, Musk says he purchased X to stop that from happening. But the fact is that these leaders of these companies do have that capacity to turn the dial one way or the other based on the ideas that they want to get out there. So in some ways, America is more free speech than ever if you look at Supreme Court jurisprudence and how the courts interpret what people can say. But there's a contrast between the ability to say something and the ability to get it out there. And what the tech companies can do is limit your ability to get it out there as opposed to preventing you from saying it to begin with.
The best illustration of that, by the way, is an amazing book called by Michael Schudson called Inventing the News, I think, and he talks about how in the 1840s, all of a sudden you have this notion of objectivity in journalism. Why? Two things. One is the telegraph, you paid for every extra adjective. So you wanted to strip it down to, what do we call it, just the facts, ma'am. And you had the rise of these organizations like Associated Press, which in order to sell their product, didn't want to be just bought by the Republican, the Whig Party or the Democratic Party in the 1840s, and then eventually the Republican Party, Democratic Party. They wanted to be able to sell to both. So the rise of objectivity was itself triggered by a commercial desire, and then it became an ideal. And it's one of the interesting things about American history is the degree to which sometimes we think, oh, the ideal started and then it created a certain reality. Sometimes certain business realities and certain profit motives lead to certain ideals and ideological positions. It's a fun book to teach.
Thank you for the panel. It's wonderful to participate as an audience member. I just wanted to ask, I hear that from both of you a lot about, in a way, about morality, in that the universities are not, at least they either don't have morality, or the morality is a twisted morality. And this is, while you spoke about, the titans of business having, the CEO of, you said of Chase goes to Washington so often, which is obviously politics. It's not necessarily morality. So I hear there's a lack of morality, but this has been going on for a long time. Bloom, Dershowitz, so many others have written about this over the years. So what can we do as just, people sitting in the audience to help turn the tide of morality to good?
Well, the first thing is, I always say it starts at home. You have to model good behavior, not just for yourself, but to your children and to your community. So a little bit goes a long way in that direction. But you also have to call out immorality where you see it. And you can't just say, well, I don't like those Democrats, so I'll ignore it when the Republicans do it, or vice versa. You really need to be intellectually honest. And it's hard to do because the Twitter mobs will come after you. But I think you have to be consistent in your beliefs in what morality is. And the more you have people doing it, the more people show the courage to do it, the more you get a groundswell of others willing to join.
I had the privilege of writing Never Alone with Natan Sharansky, which we called a manifestoir or a memoir-festo, kind of taking the story of his life to kind of articulate a Zionist vision. And in one of the first interviews we did, I said, it's quite amazing. We come from totally different worlds. I grew up in the vast shopping center called North America. He grew up in the vast prison camp called the Soviet Union. I spent the 80s studying history. He spent the 80s making history. I spent the 80s at Harvard. He spent the 80s in the Gulag. And then he said, yes, so I have moral clarity and you don't. And it wasn't a slam on me, it was a slam on the world that we came from. And I've been saying three very clear words to students since October 7th, but even before. Grow a spine. This is a moment in history where you have to stand up. And I don't think, I need my left-wing friends fighting left-wing anti-Semitism. I need our right-wing friends fighting right-wing anti-Semitism. That stupid argument about which is worse, left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism. If it's anti-Semitism, it's unacceptable. We've got to get out of the partisan dimensions. We've got to get out of this whole approach of, Donald Trump is perfectly evil or perfectly good, Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris. Let's live with complexity. And let's stand for something. Let's stand for truth. And truth is messy. Truth is ugly. But also there are certain clear moral red lines. And we all have to stand together. And if we had more of that moral clarity, and we were willing to, one by one, and this is the reason why I'm writing letters to the students, because I still believe in the students. I still believe you can make change. We've lived through so many changes. So if we've seen things that sometimes lead us to not inspiration but to despair, we can change the tide of history. And every day we live this miracle here, and every day we still live this miracle there. And we have to be miracle makers for tomorrow.
Yeah, I would just say Gil and I wouldn't do what we do if we didn't think it could have an impact.
Hi, thank you for having this panel. I'm looking forward to reading your book, Dr. Troy. I'm waiting for the Cliff Notes to come out so that I can read it more intensely. You started to talk about this a little bit. Can you compare and contrast why American CEOs meet with the president, what they get, and why they meet with an Israeli politician? I mean, someone mentioned Elon Musk. He was used as an ornament by our prime minister when he addressed Congress. We're sitting in the Bernstein Hall, meaning there's a very long history of American. We don't really call them CEOs here. We call them Forbes 400 people because that's what we're more focused on. But there is a very serious relationship between all Israeli politicians and American business people. Why are they so interested in Israel? What are they getting out of it? What are Israeli politicians getting out of it? And how does that compare to American presidents and CEOs?
Well, let me take the first part of the question, Mitch, where you talk about what CEOs get out of dealing with Washington. And I have this interesting analysis in the book that comes in part from a company called Barron Public Affairs. And they say if there's a big fight in Washington between two companies in one industry or between two different industries, let's say the hospitals and the insurers, this analysis says that they basically fight themselves to a draw in terms of the amount of lobbying resources and campaign contributions that they can throw at the issue. And so if they're going to spend equivalent amounts, what's going to be the tiebreaker? And what I argue in the book is that the CEO can be the tiebreaker. If you have a CEO who's willing to engage with the public and also with politicians to make the case for their industry or their company, then they can have a huge impact in a way that a CEO that's just focusing on the logistics and making the business run won't be able to have. So I think that's why a lot of them get involved in politics. Now, why companies see benefits to Israel, well, it's our friend over here who wants me to tell AIPAC to work on CEOs. I think that's an additional thing. But Israel has innovation. And there's so many countries in the world where there's no innovation. They're just intellectually stultified. And you can feel it on the streets here. I've been here 4 times since October 7th. And the first time was the most difficult. It was in November, and there was obviously shell shock. But just walking the streets in my subsequent visits, you feel a vibrancy here that you don't often feel when you go to other countries or when you go to many parts of the United States of America. And CEOs want that talent. They want that innovation. They want those new ideas because it can help them grow their businesses and be more successful and have more impact.
Let's boycott Fords because Henry Ford was such an anti-Semite. Oh, no, let's buy Fords, and actually drive a Ford, because Hank Deuce, Henry Ford's grandson, not only was a donor to Israel, but also had a car factory that he opened up in Nazareth, Nazareth of all places. History is complicated, and also we know that Jews make news, and there is it's interesting the degree to which the Jewish state looms large in the minds of so many Americans, the minds of so many Westerners, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse.
A lot of the Israeli innovation that we see, especially in high tech, is also connected to the investment in army, where a lot of the best and the brightest get their compensation for often the weak education they had before they got to the army. I'm curious, we've had these horrific 10 months since October 7th. Before that, we had 9 months of protest over the judicial overthrow or judicial reform, whichever way you want to see it, where most of the younger business leaders, and again, there's a lot of new money in Israel, which is also different. So things here, it's small, it happens fast, things evolve quickly, and it's a very segmented society. I'm wondering how you see these things applying here right now in the middle of this country, in the middle of one of the worst conflicts we've ever lived through, and where those corporate leaders are, what their role is, and how that relates to the political leadership moving forward.
It's a great question, and your amazing children who have learned so much as whizzes in the Army understand the power of the Army, right? And it's interesting, the Army is the great blessing and curse of Israel, right? Because it is the innovation center, and it is a training ground, and we've seen the degree to which it matures our kids, and it teaches them skills, but we also see, of course, the high cost that's imposed when such wonderful, amazing kids end up having to sacrifice life, limb, and also neshama for the sake of the Jewish people and the sake, I argue, of Western civilization. So there are 2 ways of answering your question. One of the things I think we all keep on hoping is that the Miluim will save us. We're hoping that the achdut, the unity that we've seen in the trenches, in the front lines, the tremendous sacrifice, this generation. I've never been one of these people who go, oh, kids these days. But there are all these people who are saying, oh, I used to complain about the TikTok generation, and now we're seeing how amazing they are. So part of it is hoping that there'll be some kind of push from the reservists, as we saw after the 1973 war, saying there are certain red lines that our politicians have been crossing, and it's time to change that. And what's been interesting is that, when you talk about actually the CEOs here, we've seen tremendous generosity Right, we had lunch today in Piccolino, and my older brother Dan pointed out the fact that this restaurant, which probably isn't having one of its banner years, is serving 80 meals every Friday to lone soldiers. And that's a very small example. We could go to the Israeli corporation, which I know spend tens of millions of dollars in giving to the war effort. So what I've actually seen this year is I've seen the generosity of the CEOs. I haven't heard them articulating an alternative to the political vacuum that we see on the left and on the right, and I haven't seen them really giving us a future. And I hope that actually there can be a link between the CEOs and the Miluimnikim, the reservists, to help make this country live up, not just to its deserved reputation, not just to its dreams, but to its amazing, amazing young people who inspire us and defend us every day.
Yeah. A follow-up question to the one on academia. Where is the solution? Is it with the model of Dennis Prager? Is it something else? Is it a combination? What can be done to change this herd mentality in academia? And will it really affect the corporate world?
Yeah, I would say all of the above. I mean, if you look at if you talk to the people who do PragerU, they initially wanted to start a new university, and they calculated how many billions it would cost to do that, and they figured that they could reach more people by doing this Prager University, and it's been very successful. They do reach a lot of people with videos, and I've shown them to my kids about just explainers on key issues. But then you also have ideas like what's going on at the University of Austin. Start a new university that focuses on the humanities, isn't focused on politics, but is just focused on passing on the greatness of Western civilization to the next generation. And then there are those people, and I admire them. If I'm not sure I'd recommend it for my children, they're willing to go into the belly of the beast, into Harvard and Columbia, and stand up and fight for America and for Western civilization and for Israel. And I think we need all of the above. I think we need new models. I think we need new universities. And I think we need to try and improve the existing universities. And it's not easy, but I think everybody's got a role to play. And whichever place where you see the opportunity and where you see you have the capacity to help, I think everyone in this next generation needs to try and do that.
I think that is, first of all, a perfect place to end. And I want to thank our speakers. Now I'm going to make a statement against interest, which is that dessert is right there outside. But I'd like just 30 seconds to, I think, build off of something that you said, Gil. And it was when you were describing kind of how Israel was not good at socialism. Given that we both come from kind of old Beitari families, apparently, you're well aware of the fact, for instance, that members of different undergrounds, even after serving in the army and becoming, part of the Israeli citizenry, couldn't work in the public sector, and that Ben-Gurion himself was checked by the court in the 50s for trying to strip, a PhD out of a history teaching position in the public schools. And in more recent history, I have to mention, because I completely appreciate the good work that Achim HaNeshek has done since the war. But I was also there last year when they, at least some of their leadership, literally vandalized a think tank and stacked concrete and barbed wire and all sorts of other stuff in front of an office in which some of my friends were locked. And I think in both of these cases, we have to acknowledge the complexity of looking at it kind of from as Americans in a way, although we live here and we're quite integrated at this point. But we can't discount accountability in favor of just kind of moving forward. Accountability is what will allow us to put the worst parts of our history behind us and move forward into a new conversation.